Good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you here. Great to be here in Wilmington. It was an easy drive down, and my first time here. So it's wonderful to see such a vibrant congregation here in the heart of the city. I was just sharing with your pastor what a gorgeous sanctuary this is. It's just lovely to be present with you, and I think this talk and our time together this morning will in some ways fit nicely with the sermon we just heard and with the kind of message of a need for love in a time of great challenge. And we're certainly living through a time of great challenge. A word about myself: I'm a historian. I am a historian of American Christianity. I really work at the intersection of Christianity and public life in the modern United States. One of the reasons I love history is because I think it sheds light on how we got here. And I think if we want to have any sense of what it might mean to move forward faithfully, we've got to know how we got here. I often teach and talk at Princeton Seminary about the need. History is not just for history buffs. History is really for all believers, for anyone who cares about the life of the church and the life of the world. We will be better poised to love our neighbor if we have a sense of what the saints who have gone before us were up to, of the mistakes they made, of the accomplishments that they had in their own life. We can learn from them and with them. Part of what I love then, and part of why I think history really matters, is because it does speak also to the present. Last year at Princeton Seminary, we started a new series of conversations on the future of American democracy, and we talked extensively actually about the very theme of today's talk, about kind of polarization. We're living in this time of great polarization. Part of the reason that Princeton Seminary we're thinking about the future of American democracy, these are uncertain times for democracy in the United States and around the world. And there's a question, and many folks, as we went through this conversation series last year, had a question: well, do we really want to hear what people of faith have to say in this conversation? People of faith haven't necessarily distinguished themselves in recent years for being especially constructive contributors to debates about the future of American democracy. But I believe, and I think that there really truly are resources in our faith, in our traditions. And at Princeton Seminary, we've been trying to give voice to the possibility of having illuminating, fair, yes, broad conversations across lines of difference. This was one of the first public conversations we had last year with a Republican congressman from Michigan, with Bernie Sanders' former communications director, Simone Sanders. This is Peter Meyer, and Jane Coaston, who is an op-ed writer for the New York Times. Over the course of this fall conversation about polarization, I talked to pastors from across theological divides, the author of a new book that I'm going to talk about briefly this morning called The Persuaders, Senator Chris Murphy, who's been working in the United States Senate trying to forge bipartisan agreement around what he would consider common sense gun reform. It's a tough time to come together across lines that divide. I want to argue today that it's possible and that it's vital, and that people of faith, people in mainline Presbyterian churches like this one, have an important role to play in that story. So, blessed be the tie that binds. We are living through an era marked by alarming levels of polarization, punctuated by all too visceral and sometimes even violent moments of confrontation. In recent years, we've been bombarded with images of videos of roiling conflict as it's played out, not just around the world, but right here in the United States, everywhere from Charlottesville, Virginia, to Portland, Oregon, to the grounds of the United States Capitol building. The consequences of polarization are evident, though, far beyond these kinds of flashpoints. In recent years, our society here in the United States, we have struggled to deal constructively with any number of the cascading crises that are facing us in this moment, from immigration to mass incarceration, from inequality, economic inequality, to structural racism, from the coronavirus pandemic to an epidemic of gun violence that, as we all know, we saw tragically yet again played out this week in Maine. It's probably not the case that contemporary levels of division are unprecedented. We fought a civil war in this country. I think it's important to remember that even as we do face really alarming levels of polarization, we have faced difficult conflict in the past. But even this kind of historical perspective brings only modest relief when we realize that today, many young people really are worried that they might see another civil war in their lifetime. We've got to be worried when we know that today we are seeing more and more Americans who see their neighbors as enemies. Mistrust has deepened across our society. This is actually old data. This is from 2014. It's a chart that reflects the kind of how Republicans and Democrats perceive each other. This survey found that perceptions of the other party as a threat to the nation's well-being were at historic highs. But this data is almost 10 years old. And a more recent survey found that 60% of Democrats now regard the Republican Party as, quote, a serious threat to the United States, that fully 70% of Republicans regard the Democratic Party as a serious threat to the United States. So, historical context being what it may be, we face real challenges. Part of what we know is that these divisions that afflict our political parties and our political system run straight through the heart of American Christianity. Christians, the churches, are not somehow apart from polarization. We don't sit outside of this framework. We are fully ensconced within it. My colleague over at the university, now emeritus, Robert Wuthnow, a well-known sociologist, wrote a very important book a generation ago called The Restructuring of American Religion. In that book, he argued that denominational identities, which had long been really important for a lot of folks. If you were Presbyterian, that was an important part of who you were. If you were Methodist, that was an important part of who you were. And sometimes there were great fights, right? Within those denominational kind of frameworks. Wuthnow found already 40 years ago that denominational loyalties were receding, and that they were being replaced by a kind of supercharged political identity, that politics was becoming kind of the new governing framework, that the major lines of divisions were no longer between Presbyterians, Methodists, and maybe Catholics. They were between conservatives and liberals, and there were plenty of bad feelings to go around. This is from that book now. I'm going to just briefly read a quote. Wuthnow wrote, "Both ends of the theological spectrum thought their opponents had too much influence, especially over religious agencies, the government, and the schools. It's not surprising that people should think this way, given the public statements their leaders have made. Tall steeples, no people was the phrase one pastor of a large conservative church used to characterize his liberal counterparts. They've kept only the bathwater and thrown everything else out," declared a liberal critic in an impassioned sermon about fundamentalists. Recounting the, quote, inflexibility, intolerance, and passion for annihilation among evangelicals, another liberal pastor said it made him think of, quote, the Great Inquisition and the Dark Ages. Shilly-shallying, a conservative pastor told an interviewer, "We want no association with churches that can't get serious about preaching the Christian faith." Those quotes are all from 1988. Safe to say, these bad feelings have only gotten worse. We've seen over the last generation continued infighting, splitting, division. In fact, political polarization is one thing driving many pastors out of ministry right now. There's a kind of historic uptick in pastors who are resigning, and polarization is one driving factor. In a season like the one that we're living in, it can feel like it's always been this way. That we've always been hyper-polarized, that we've never been able to come together across lines of difference. One of the things I think history can also do, in addition to telling us how we got here, I think we could talk, we don't have enough time today to get into all this. History can help us to think about how we got to this hyper-polarized moment that we're in right now. But it can also shed light on other kinds of moments. And I want to talk about another kind of moment today with you just briefly before coming back to the present. Sometimes in my field over the last generation, we've told the story of American Protestantism as one of like epic, hyper-polarized clashes between fundamentalists and liberals, or between mainliners and evangelicals. But I want to share with you a different sort of outlook on the story of American Protestantism over the last century, where I think, of course, there was that conflict, there is that conflict has escalated in recent years. But for much of the 20th century, in my own view, the story of American Protestant life, the big story really is the story of how American Protestants built a big tent. A big, unwieldy, fractious tent. One organizational kind of apparatus that was a major reflection of this desire to build a bigger tent was the Federal Council of Churches, founded in 1908. Was its successor, the National Council of Churches, is still around to the present day. It's an important ecumenical Protestant organization. A lot of times when people have written about the Federal Council of Churches, they've written about it as a reflection of kind of liberal Protestantism. But in fact, when the Federal Council was founded in 1908, it included dozens of denominations. It included denominations that were really across the theological spectrum. It included immigrant churches. It included 4 of the most prominent historically black denominations in the country. It included folks in the North and the South. It included folks who deeply, deeply disagreed about theological questions, political questions. The driving energy behind the Federal Council's founding in 1908 was twofold. One, the hope of building a bigger tent that would showcase the unity of the churches of Christ. That together, Christians could find ways to hang together. But they also believed that if they worked together, they would be better poised to contribute to a more just society. And so that shared witness, that shared unity might produce a better world. This is hard work. Really hard work. And part of the reality of this work is that it can feel at times, and I think in fact there can be at times situations in which the pull toward unity, which is the biblical call for the unity of Christ's church, can be in great tension with the call to justice. Because how do you hold together in the midst of great difference and at the same time prophetically witness to the need for real change in our society? Sometimes you hear today talk about the purple church. And I have mixed feelings about the notion of a purple church. On the one hand, I'm going to argue today that we should find ways to hang together in the midst of deep difference. Sometimes, though, I think a purple church can be a goal that's lifted up that doesn't attend to the need for Christians to really witness, as your pastor did today, actually, to the need for a strong voice for justice in our society and in our world. And that's sometimes when we want to just hang together, we just put aside all the hard conversations. We just stuff those under the rug and say, well, now we're all here together, and that's the good. When in fact, God is also calling us not just to be here together, but to find ways to speak together. So I want to just briefly, we have a short time, but I want to briefly take you through what I see as a kind of case study that I think has important implications for how we think about navigating these issues today. The case study is the way that the Federal Council of Churches and its successor, the National Council of Churches, navigated the major conflict that arose in the mid-20th century around civil rights and the civil rights movement. Throughout its early years, the FCC was sort of a white moderate organization that criticized race prejudice, quote unquote. It criticized lynching, but it long endorsed kind of voluntary acts of goodwill over major shifts in public policy. It called for race relations Sundays, where there would be exchanges of delegates from black and white congregations. But, and this is really, I think, important and key, in 1946, the Federal Council of Churches, this huge, lumbering, unwieldy, big tent Protestant organization, became the first predominantly white organization in the country to condemn Jim Crow, issuing a statement in which it, quote, renounced the pattern of segregation as, quote, unnecessary and undesirable and a violation of the gospel of love and human brotherhood. And it moreover pledged to, quote, work for a non-segregated church in a non-segregated society. These were fighting words in 1946. Remember that this organization includes lots of folks in the South. It includes lots of folks all over the nation, including in the North, who were very happy to just sort of remain quiet about racial apartheid as it was developing in the South. The statement emerged, and this is part of what I think is really interesting, out of decades of painstaking work and skillful maneuvering by folks like Benjamin Mays. Benjamin Mays and George Haynes were officials within the Federal Council of Churches, these predominantly white organizations where they were used to having to deal with Southern and Northern white Protestants who were not keen on the Federal Council taking strong positions on racial justice. But Mays and Haynes worked with white allies within the Federal Council. They worked diligently within a tent that was often far from hospitable to the work that they wanted to do. And over the course of decades, they got this big, unwieldy tent to take an important stand. And in 1946, it was judged across the United States as a big deal. One of the nation's leading black newspapers, the Chicago Defender, proclaimed, quote, "Jim Crow and the church were divorced this week by the Federal Council of Churches of Christ in America." Within months of the FCC statement, and this is part of the virtues of this big tent, right? It had a lot of influence. People paid attention to what it did. Within 6 months or so, a half dozen Protestant denominations, the YMCA, the YWCA, all joined with the Federal Council in its condemnation of Jim Crow. Now, beneath the surface, there's still roiling conflict within the ranks of the Federal Council. Folks who weren't happy about the statement, folks who hoped that the FCC wouldn't, quote, make this mistake again. In fact, the struggle would go on. It's hard to hang together through tough issues when you have such a wide array of folks inside the tent. In 1948, just 2 years later, folks within the FCC produced a new statement. This is kind of in conjunction with the United Nations new statement on human rights. A new statement declaring that human rights, quote, "cannot be obtained under a system of racial segregation." And this statement once more provoked concerted internal opposition. The council was prepared to move forward over and against the vehement criticism of Southern Presbyterian delegates when a Methodist bishop from Pennsylvania, a Northern white Protestant, made a last-ditch parliamentary intervention attempting to refer this stronger statement to committee where it could die, where it could be tabled forever. The move prompted one black minister from Gary, Indiana, to rise up and indignantly declare, quote, "Most of you do not know the horror of having money in your pocket and being unable to buy food, or being sleepy and not being able to find a place to sleep." His words generated loud cheers and renewed resolve, and the statement passed. But these kinds of heroics were required every time. Yet again in 1952, when Southern delegates attempted to slow the adoption of a, quote, "statement on the churches and segregation" by the FCC's successor organization, the National Council of Churches. Harlem's Abyssinian Baptist Church, disgusted by the tactics of these delegates who were trying to slow down the process of adopting the statement, voted to secede from the Federal Council, along with their pastor, Adam Clayton Powell, remarking, "How can we expect the legislators of America to be more Christ-like than their clergymen?" That same day, 75 African Methodist Episcopal ministers met in New York City, passed a resolution demanding that the National Council move the statement forward. This additional pressure produced a needed breakthrough, and a strong version of the statement passed. But, and this is crucial, these methods, these heroics didn't always work. Sometimes the bewildering diversity within the Federal Council, along with the propensity of its overwhelmingly white male leadership to prioritize the concerns of their constituents, yielded a deeply sinful failure to witness against the most heinous evil. Sometimes that desire to just hang together, to find ways to be together, superseded the need for a strong position. The case in point. when in 1955, 14-year-old Emmett Till was heinously tortured and murdered in the South, the National Council of Churches failed to muster even just a strongly worded statement. One was composed by the black leader of the Department of Racial and Cultural Relations, but in the face of white consternation about criticizing the verdict of a jury, it was allowed to die in committee. Lord have mercy. The perils of a big tent approach. But there was promise too. These Protestant organizations, the National Council, the Federal Council, did more than just issue statements. They did not wait for every member denomination to get on board before they commenced with doing the Lord's work on the ground. In fact, both the FCC and the NCC leaned into the idea that their responsibility was not only to speak for the churches, but sometimes to speak prophetically to the churches. This happened regularly throughout the 1950s and the 1960s as the National Council of Churches invested resources into supporting communities as they began to desegregate their public schools, as it provided legal assistance and bail money to freedom fighters across the South, and as it mobilized to lobby at the grassroots and in Washington in support of major civil rights legislation. It did this as a junior partner of civil rights organizations like the NAACP, CORE, SNCC, and others. But in no small part, it was because of the size, it was because of the fact that the National Council contained multitudes of folks who did not agree. Finding ways to do God's work, even in the midst of deep disagreement, that people paid attention. In the years immediately following King's letter from Birmingham jail, the church's leadership, example, involvement in the struggle in places like Indiana and Iowa helped to expand the coalition of United States senators who were willing to vote yes on the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So a big tent vision that manages to find ways to hold faith and justice together can do remarkable things. But it's really tough. It was tough then. It's gotten tougher. You do a whole nother session on what happened to this organization and what happened to this kind of public witness. The reality is that the experience of the National Council through the Civil Rights era, through the Vietnam War era, took a toll with folks, young folks who were impatient with the organization's kind of faltering witness, wanted something more radical, said, I don't know if I want to go to the church that my parents and my grandparents have loved throughout their lives. There were conservatives within these denominations who said, this is too radical. This is too much. And they left and they split off and they fell away from the kind of mainline Protestant big tent vision. As I see it, and I want to come back to today here and think for a moment with you about what we can learn, and then I'd love to hear your questions. At its best, the Federal Council and the National Council did something that is very hard to do and that we're struggling to do right now. When you have a deep disagreement, sometimes the depth of disagreement is about things that really matter, about people's lives. People's lives are at stake. The shape of our communities are at stake. There's an understandable impulse to say, I don't want to be in an organization with that person. I don't want to go to church with that person. At Princeton Seminary, we deal with this all the time. We have our student body runs the gamut, theologically and politically and all over the board. And I have students come to my office and say, I don't want to sit in a classroom with this person and have to hear what they think. I don't want to hear their... And honestly, I understand, and I think there are real concerns about harm that are real and important and that we have to grapple with as we think about finding ways to hang together in congregations, let alone in denominations and in communities beyond. But at the same time, I don't know a better way. I don't know what the option we have is. We don't, the people that we disagree with don't just disappear because we disagree with them. They're in the world, they're in our communities, they're in our churches. wherever you stand, there's probably people in this church that may disagree with you. And so the question is, how do we navigate that disagreement? I want to give you a few suggestions here at the end. The book that I had up on the screen earlier, The Persuaders, is an argument that in this moment of deep division, one of the things that's happening is that people are giving up on persuasion altogether. That we are just prone to, whatever your politics may be, whatever your theological outlook may be, we're prone right now to saying, that person disagrees with me, and I want nothing to do with them, and I'm never going to change their mind. They're never going to change their mind. In fact, they're just bad all the way down. And the book, The Persuaders, by Anand Giridharadas, I interviewed him last year. He's a person himself on the left, concerned about this phenomenon on the left, where he's worried that people on the left are too ready to write folks off that don't already agree, and that may mean that, in fact, the things that folks on the left hope for are less likely to come to be. They're less likely to be realized because there are fewer people who believe them. And so he said to me in this conversation, he said, I believe we've got to be evangelical about what we believe. He's not an evangelical, right? But he says, I believe we've got to be evangelical about what we believe. We've got to get out there and try to convince folks, if we really believe the things we do, we've got to hope and spend time and have the conversations and make the arguments and make our case. And one of the things he writes about in his book, I recommend the book, and this has gotten some national attention, is this idea of deep canvassing. I don't know if you've heard of this. This is a new thing in politics, but I think it's much more broadly relevant as well. It used to be that in political canvassing, your idea, one predominant strategy in recent years has been, you don't have a lot of time, you got limited folks who can knock on doors. You only knock on the doors of people you think already agree, and the idea is to turn them out, right? And if you run into somebody who you thought already agreed with you and it turns out they didn't, you're like, okay, well, thank you so much for your time, I'm out. In Arizona and around the country, there's this new approach to canvassing called deep canvassing, where you knock on every door and you hang out for up to 30 minutes. And the idea of the deep canvassing is not that you're going to change someone's mind who's dug in. And in fact, Giridharadas would argue, you're not going to change everybody's mind, period. But he thinks there's a lot more people whose minds can be changed than we think sometimes. So the idea with deep canvassing is, like in Arizona, they've been doing this around immigration stuff. And you knock on someone's door, and they have the opposite view from the bill you're trying to get through on immigration, and you say, well, has your child ever struggled in their life? Tell me about, and you ask questions that engage them beneath the surface of whatever their felt political identity is, and you seek to connect with them. And what people are finding is that this is a way of tilling the ground, of creating new forms of connection that works. You don't change someone's mind in the course of a 30-minute conversation at their door. But for Giridharadas, he says, on almost every issue, even when people feel that they're convinced that they have their mind made up, there's a side B. There's another experience. There's someone that they know. There's something that they've thought or felt in their own life. And if, rather than just going at them with the idea of we disagree and we're never going to agree and we're going to, if you can find a way to connect, that actually people can surprise you. So one of the major things that I think comes out of this literature at the social scientific level, but I've also experienced in my own life, is that the main way people change their minds is through relationship. These are pictures of me, 2 different points in my life. These are 2 of my best friends, both of whom I met my freshman year of college, and we've been friends for a long time. I grew up in, again, we don't have time to talk too much, but I grew up in kind of the world of conservative evangelicalism in Kansas and Southern California and moral majority kind of circles. And I went to Georgetown University, and I was placed my freshman year with the son of a Democratic congressman. And one of my other best friends grew up in the Bronx in really a challenged neighborhood. And, as I think back about the things that I thought and said in conversations with these two guys when I was a freshman in college, and I look back on that now and I gosh, I can't believe I ever thought that, but I did. And one of the things that's really interesting to me about, relationships and what can happen, and that I'm worried about right now, and I think as I think about a call to action for a congregation like this, I think about this at the students I teach at Princeton Seminary. Are we able to love people when they're wrong? I was wrong, I think, on a number of key questions when I was 18 years old. And these guys knew better than me. I think they already were much further along the road toward the right answers on a number of key questions. And yet they somehow managed to be my friend. And it was actually through late night debates over too much pizza that I didn't admit it in the moment, but I started to change my mind. And sometimes I worry as we move through this season of intense hyperpolarization, and I hear it from my students who say, I don't want that kind of student to be admitted to Princeton Seminary. I don't want that kind of student to be in my classroom. I worry that we are not forming ourselves and the folks in our midst to love others even when they're wrong. Now, I think there's a key qualifier here, which I don't think all of us are called into every kind of conversation. I don't think that the work of hanging in relationship with people who are wrong, if we've had an experience ourselves, if we have a marginalized identity, if we have an experience of trauma around, because of the way that we grew up, I don't know that every person is not called into every kind of tough relationship, but I feel called into it. And I think that we may be called into it more often than we sometimes think. I'm going to end with this and then open it up. I think part of the thing, as I think about from a historical vantage, as I think about kind of reading around and all the conversations I've had over the last couple of years with social scientists and politicians and journalists and the like, that one of the things that I think Christians can hold on to and can be about in a season of hyperpolarization is we can hold on to the hope and the possibility of transformation, that people do experience transformation in their lives. Maybe you've experienced transformation in your life. Maybe you've seen transformation in the life of a loved one. I believe in the power and the possibility of transformation, and I think this is one of the things in our society right now that there's a risk of giving up on. That people can change their minds, that people can be transformed. I think that the way that most often happens is through the people that they know and the people that love them. And sometimes we don't want to answer the call to love somebody in our life who really bugs us and who we really think is deeply wrong about something. One of the persons that I talked to last year was Bishop Karen Oliveto. She's the first openly queer bishop in the United Methodist Church, and she's experienced all kinds of grief along the way through her leadership and through her ministry. She talked about this in this conversation. It was a fabulous conversation with her, with a Princeton Seminary alum, Melissa Flora Bixler, who's a Mennonite pastor in North Carolina, and Duke Kwan, who's a Presbyterian pastor in D.C. And as I listened to these three pastors wrestling with how in their own congregations they're finding ways to hang together in the midst of deep difference, I thought they put all the big issues on the table, and they were going back and forth and giving the best voice to the reasons why sometimes they don't want to have great difference in their congregation, and sometimes, but Bishop Oliveto, she talked eloquently. She's an openly queer bishop in a denomination that's actively coming apart over the question of human sexuality. And when we talked about a year ago, she was reflecting on what's going on in the United Methodist Church. And as I said, she's experienced a lot of harm in her own right. But she talked about the fact that she lamented, she said, the departure of the conservatives from the UMC. And she said she lamented it. She said, I lament it because, and this is a close paraphrase, she said, they need transformation. And I worry as they go their own way that maybe they won't be transformed. But then she said, as I read the Bible and as I reflect on my own life, I know that God's not done with me yet either. I need transformation. And that's what the Holy Spirit can do. And so it's that hope in transformation that I think can be also a call to hang together in times of great division. But we got to find ways to hang together, and I think that example of the federal and the national council underscores it for me. We've got to find ways to hang together that don't impede our faithfulness and our call, biblical call, to really testify to God's love for all of our neighbors. And sometimes when those things are in tension, it's going to create tough conversations. And you got to think about, how are we going to navigate these tough conversations? How are we going to find ways to hold together in the midst of deep difference when actually we need to say something today about something that's going on in our own communities or in our wider society? I don't have all the answers for you, but I think if I was going to leave you with one thing, it would be to hold on to the possibility of persuasion, to hold on to the idea that relationship, including with folks with whom we disagree, can be a vehicle for transformation, and that transformation really is possible. We've got time for questions, I think.
If you could hold on one second, I'll pass the microphone.
Hi, I just wanted to follow up on something you discussed about seminarians being concerned and not wanting to hear the other side.
Yeah.
If seminarians are feeling that way, how do we have hope for the rest of the world?
Yeah.
And what's being done to address that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think seminarians don't arrive to seminary fully formed. And part of what, but part of what I hear in their concerns, valid concerns, really, I truly do. But I also think Princeton Seminary remains a place where we are trying to hang together in the midst of deep difference. And I don't see us moving away from that anytime soon. And I have hope through that. And I think as they go through the experience with us and as we learn from them, many folks do find reason to, they find that there are gifts. And this is the thing that, we reflect on a lot right now. There are gifts in the way that our community is set up to bring together people across lines of difference, even though it's really hard. And when big issues come up, I mean, we're not impervious from right now. Our student body is struggling with, Israel and Palestine. Our student body has struggled around questions of human sexuality, questions around race. We've done a lot of work on our own institutional histories of racism, and finding ways to sustain healthy conversation. It's really hard right now, but we're doing it. Yeah.
Are you going to talk about Sarah? My husband and I both want to talk.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
I want to give you an example.
Yeah.
I really like the idea of the deep canvassing.
Yeah.
And just bringing people together on opposite sides. Our daughter is a Delaware State Senator. She's transgender.
Yeah.
And two things. I think at the very simplest level, bringing people together to discuss both sides.
Yeah.
But listening is an important tool.
Absolutely.
And she has been able to pass bills with bipartisan support.
Yeah.
She listens. She brings them to the table and respects them, is not confrontational. And what has transpired since she's been in the legislature for 2020 is not only the passing of bipartisan bills with support, but I have one story to tell you. The most conservative Republican member of the Senate, who my guess is would support anti-trans bills and has, came to her at the end of session and said to her, and he's a former cop, said to her, "I've got your back." And she had announced that she was running for Congress. And she is running for Congress. And we were petrified, and she was, for her safety. But he said, "I want you to know I've got your back, and I take a bullet for you." So she talks about hope. Even with everything that is happening, even with all the anti-trans bills across the country, she talks about hope. So I love hearing what you had to say. And I do believe in it. Let me just say, it is hard.
It's hard. Yeah, thank you so much for that. It's powerful. Yeah.
Well, at the risk of our family monopolizing the mic, I actually have two questions.
Yeah, sure.
And let me start by saying that I share your concern that we are polarized to the point of danger.
Yeah.
But the two issues that I've struggled with, and I'll ask both in the form of a question
Yeah.
and get your reaction. One is, it seems to me that when we approach public policy issues in the context of moral questions, when we frame our answers in the context of this is what morality requires, it heightens polarization because we're implicitly saying to the other side, you're immoral, and we're condemning them, and we are justifying our own position to the point where it makes it difficult for us to compromise. The second question I have, it's almost at the different end of the spectrum, is it seems to me that sometimes we get to the point where the division is so great and the hope for reconciliation so small and the issue so important that we have to choose sides. And so your reaction to both those?
Yeah. I don't know that we can avoid the fact that, I mean, political questions are fundamentally questions about how do we live together in the world. And I think those raise, I mean, they just genuinely are ethical, moral, spiritual questions. And I think, you know, some of the people that I respect the most in terms of connecting, you know, Christian faith and public life have been able to speak to that God cares about how we live together in the world at some level. And so it is hard to negotiate conversations about issues that are so deeply, they're so weighty. And they're weighty morally and they're weighty in terms of our faith. It can be done, and there are ways to find ways to say, I believe this with all my being, that it is immoral to take this point of view, but also to be able to have that conversation, I think, with somebody who does disagree with you about it in a way that doesn't end the conversation. And I think we could talk about examples of that. You know, when I was at Valparaiso University in Valparaiso, Indiana, kind of purple university town right outside Chicago for 7 years. And when I was there, I got really involved in the community. And it was when Mike Pence was governor of Indiana, and the Indiana State Legislature passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and there was a lot of concerns in Valparaiso and across the state that this was going to produce a new wave of discrimination against LGBTQ people. And I was the chair of the Human Relations Council in Valpo and sort of helped, our council brought forth a bill that was a civil rights bill offering civil rights to gay and trans people in the city of Valparaiso amid a statewide, and that was a remarkable experience. We had public meetings where people came out and gave 3-minute speeches for and against, and almost everybody talked about Jesus. But we made it through that. That law passed. One of the pastors of the largest churches in town spoke publicly against the bill and was quoted in the newspaper the next day, and I reached out to him and asked if we could talk. And at the end of the talk, we didn't agree.
Oh, yeah.
But he did say, I'm not going to continue to mobilize against this. And we struck up a friendship, and by the end, we didn't agree when I left town on a whole host of things, but we were in conversation about stuff that mattered, and I think it was good for the community. So it's tough. And sometimes we do have to, I think sometimes, and this federal council example is a good example, sometimes I think the conversation's never going to lead you to a consensus, and sometimes you just have to vote. Sometimes you just have to vote, and that's hard, and you hope that you've created a kind of community where people say, when they're on the losing end of that vote, and the people that are on the winning end of the vote, that we can still love each other even though we never got to, and I think sometimes it's imperative to take that vote, even if the conversation didn't lead to consensus. Yeah.
I just wanted to say thank you. So much resonates. And also, we are reading the book. The one book for our church right now is High Conflict.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to put out a plug if anybody hasn't read it, or if you thought you might read it and haven't gotten to it yet. It is really valuable, and I think speaks to a lot of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And we are doing some small groups right now. So sign up and get into this discussion a little bit further.
Fabulous.
Thank you so much.
Of course. My pleasure.
Other questions?
My question has to do with the role of social media in all this stuff. I have a feeling that conflict serves their purposes better than agreement, and I wondered if you'd comment a little on that.
I think it's part of, I think you're exactly right. I think there's a lot, I think social media can serve some good ends, but I think it's part of a larger conversation about the fact that there is a lot of money to be made off of anger and division, and people are making a lot of money off of these things, obviously. And so I do think social media is a part of that, and it works in sundry ways to do that. So I think it can be used in better ways, but I do think overall, I think it's really making it harder to navigate these. And like I said, that there's a lot of money on the line.
As we mature and socialize, one of the things that used to be said is, do not talk politics, do not talk religion in social circles. But I think I'm feeling that one of the things that we do need to do with love, compassion, and sensitivity is to talk politics and to talk religion. You know, so that we can have better understanding of people who don't look like us, don't think like us, don't worship like we do. So I think that's what I'm hearing. Okay. So as a senior citizen, how do we do that when I feel sometimes generationally removed from my grandchildren who have a different concept of how they communicate versus how I communicate?
So that's a great question. I haven't gotten to TikTok yet, though, so I don't know. No, I think you're right that we do need to find ways, at least I don't think each one of us needs to be a pundit that's talking to huge swaths of the public about politics and religion, but I think in our own circles, with our own friends and our own family, finding ways to sustain important conversation about the topics that we've been talking about how do we live together in the world, I think that's so vital. It can be really hard. Generationally is one line of difference that can make that really hard. And I guess my only wisdom or point of advice there is just the piece that I mentioned during the talk about relationship that, I learn from my kids, the way that they talk, the way that they think, the way that they want to talk about stuff. I mean, I'm learning from them every day. And I think it is, if we can find ways to just hang together in relationship with people, we learn from each other. So, your grandkids, and they have so much to learn from you and the wisdom that you bring to all these conversations with a longer term perspective, right? But sometimes young people, they also can, they can have some really beautiful insights. And I think just nurturing those relationships, that's the thing. I don't think there's any gizmos or gadgets or apps that are going to do that for us. It's just going to be leaning into relationship, even when it's hard. Yeah, exactly.
Any other questions? One more question? Thank you very much to Dr.
Thank
Heath
you.
Carter.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.